welcome to the Struggle Ops show, where I'm Nicholas Mori at Acuity as a developer advocate, and I've got Daniel here with me, also a developer advocate at Acuity. And today we have what I think is going to be a very interesting stream with the release candidate for Argo CD, the version 2.6 release, which has more features than I would have ever expected in a new release of Argo CD. Some of the most highly requested features of Argo CD in its entire lifespan as a project. It's probably, do you know how many years old Argo CD is?
I think it's like 6 or 7.
Yeah, 6 or 7 years at this point, which, for an open source project to still be gaining velocity after that much time is quite impressive. But more importantly, that a feature could get the most votes possible and just be coming out in this release is very exciting. And if you don't know which features I'm talking about, we'll be getting into them in detail today. But the top 3 in this release are going to be multiple sources for applications. So on top of that, there's now a rollout strategy for application sets. And then finally is parametized config management plugins. Starting off with multiple sources here. Typically when you have an application, which I'll use my Argo CD one here as an example. If we look at the manifest, typically you just have one source. You're saying, I want to pull these manifests from this Git repository using this config management tool. In this case, it's auto detecting it in this example. But the idea is now that you can have multiple sources. So you can say that I want this application to be responsible for multiple Helm charts all in the same application. Or my favorite way to use this is to have a Helm chart in a normal Helm repo, and then you can store your values files that represent the individual environments that you're going to deploy that chart to in Git. So you get kind of the best of both worlds. You can have your chart separate from the environment configuration, which as one of the best practices for GitOps, it's kind of like separating your source code away from the environment configuration, but for Helm charts.
I'm actually curious, so with this feature coming out now, what are people doing as workarounds in the meantime? How are people utilizing this similar use case right now?
Yeah, I think there's a way to do it with Customize, where if you enable the Helm functionality of Customize, you can add the chart that from a Helm chart repo into the customization, and then have the Helm values files in the same place. But with this, you can get it all into the application spec and not have to add that extra layer of customization over it, and not have to have customization and then Helm and then your values files and Git. And I think it provides a much cleaner user experience doing it this way. So you've got your Helm chart repo, and then you've got your values files repo. Alternatively, you can do it so that you're deploying, say, multiple Helm charts in the same application, or you have a Helm chart and you've got a Git repo, and you want manifests from the Git repo, and you want that Helm chart from a chart repo. And this is a great way to do both in the same application. Some would say it even eliminates some of the needs for app of apps, where you could have one application specifying all these resources instead of a parent app that specifies multiple child ones that have these sources in them. So what I'll do is we'll just jump into the actual example here. So if we switch over to VS Code for a moment, I've got some examples ready. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to take the Argo project, Argo CD example apps. There's a Helm chart in there, a Helm guestbook chart. So basically it just deploys a deployment and a service. And we're going to take the chart from there, and then we're going to take the values files from my Argo CD example apps repo. So in here, we've got Helm guestbook values, and then we've got values for dev, QA, and prod, all just slight differences representing what's unique to that environment. And then in our multi-source application here, we've got our first source, which is that from the example apps repo from Argo project. And then we've got the source for my personal repo. And you'll see here that we specify a reference for the second source called values. And then in the first source here for the Helm values parameter, we can use that reference. So $values referencing that second source, and then the path within that source to find that values files. So Helm guestbook values, values dev, which is this file here. So it should specify one replica and these resource quotas and limits for the deployment. So
interesting.
Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll add this to the cluster. So we'll go back over to Argo CD here, and if we load up the dashboard, we've got Helm guestbook dev, and we'll see we've got. Let me zoom in here. We've got our deployment and our service as we'd expect from the chart, and if we check the diff, we should see on our Helm guestbook deployment that the resources from our values file are there. So we've told it to pull these values from a second source and add them to the chart, and here we go. So one of the important notes here is that this is a beta feature, meaning that the UI and CLI support for it are pretty limited. They're coming in a future release. So if we were to check the app details here, it does not show the second source in the UI. So you'll see here there's just the one, if any, source. Am I missing it? Yeah, the repo URL and the target revision are empty. Despite, if we check the manifest, you can see the two sources for it. So it is working properly, because if I go and I sync our application here, we will get the expected resources. And it's essentially that simple for being able to handle this very common use case, I think, of having a Helm chart in one repo and the values files in another. No longer do you need to set up like a whole application set that pulls the values and injects them into the application manifest, or setting up Customize with Helm enabled to do it. There's first-party support in Argo CD for it. So what I'll do here is we're going to build on top of this example by, you'll see that we've got Helm guestbook dev. We're going to deploy a Helm guestbook QA and prod using an application set. So we'll go back over to VS Code here, and we'll take a look at our
I see where you're going here. So
Yeah.
I'm going in blind on Nick's stream here, but I have a feeling that they're all the features are gonna mesh together in this, huh?
Yeah, that's except for the config management, but these first two are I think they exist in harmony together really well. So we'll demonstrate an example of that. So what I need to do is I'm going to apply an application that basically is going to deploy the application set for us, just so we can visualize it in Argo CD. So we'll do Helm guestbook values, and then our app set app, and then we'll go back to Argo CD here. So we've got a new application, our Helm guestbook app set, and this bear with me here, this application is going to deploy an application set to the cluster, which is then going to deploy the three applications that are our Helm guestbooks. So taking a look at the diff here, we get to see the actual application set it's going to deploy. And so the important parts here is that we've got a list generator, which means these are basically the variables that are going to go into the application template. So we've got 3 environments, dev, QA, and prod, in our list generator. And then we set up a strategy for how to deploy these applications from the application set. So this is the rolling sync that we're talking about, the new feature. And for the rolling sync, we've specified 3 steps. The first step is to deploy the dev, and then the second step is QA, and the third step is prod. So what it's doing here is it's matching, I believe it's matching the label here, which, just to make sure I'm not lying, I'm gonna go double check the docs.
And it's gonna wait for those to be in a healthy state before it moves to the next, right?
Yeah. So we'll go look at the semantics of it here. So it's going to let's see, all applications in each group. So each step we've specified here is a group, and all of the applications in that group must become healthy before it'll proceed on to the next group. And so to that, there's a nuance there that if an application is considered pending for longer than the default timeout of what I believe is 5 minutes, it's going to automatically be moved to healthy, and then it'll transition onto the next group. So it's something to be aware of, that, if you have really long syncing applications, you might have to tweak that for your scenario. It's using the labels on the application resource. So when we look at here, it's looking for the NV label, and then it's looking for the label that has the dev value, which, if we look at our template for the applications, we're adding label, environment, and then the environment for that iteration of the list generator, which is going to be dev, QA, and prod. And so this example builds on top of what we were already doing, where it's the same application with multiple sources, one from the Argo CD, the official Argo project's Argo CD example apps repo to pull the chart, and then a second one to pull the values from my repo. The one change here being is that now the image tag for the chart is specified in the application set, and that'll be important later when we go to demonstrate this. So what I'll do is I'll sync this up so that we can start getting a visual of what's going to happen here. But now that the application set is synced, we can see it's rendered 3 applications: dev, QA, and prod. We'll go back out to the dashboard here. So dev was already synced thanks to our initial example, and QA and prod here need to be added. So for the initial sync here, with the resources missing, I'm going to do it manually. So we'll just synchronize those quickly. And then while that's happening, we'll go back to our application set. Actually, I guess we'll go back to VS Code to demonstrate this. So if we go back to VS Code and we go and we look at our progressive rollout application set. So what we're going to do here is we're going to update the image tag from 01 to 02, representing that I have a new version of my application I want to deploy. I want it to go to dev first, automatically go to QA, and then automatically go to prod once the application before it is healthy. And so let me double check here. We've got everything synced in the cluster. And we've got these. So I'm going to update this to 02. I'm going to push it up into my repo. with a super good commit message here, and we'll push it up, and we'll head back over to Argo CD to get a visual on this. So if we look at it, we'll refresh our app set application to show that it's now out of sync. We'll show the app diff here. So we're simply just updating the tag from 01 to 02 to demonstrate a new version of our application. So we'll sync this. And then once I sync that, it's going to start going through and doing each application one by one as we've specified in the application set here. So it'll go dev, and then QA, and then prod based on the steps in the rolling sync strategy. So we'll sync this up, and then we will go back to the applications page. We'll do environment, and so you'll see dev is syncing, and then it's progressing. So dev is going through and opening a new replica set, adding the pod with the new image. And then once that's done, it'll transition over to QA automatically. We've got through I think the top two features in this release. And so the last one here that we're going to demonstrate is the parametized config management plugins. Which for those of us that weren't here at the beginning of the intro, the idea here is that config management plugins basically allow you to have custom config management tools. So the first party support ones are like Helm, Customize, and JSON it. But a config management plugin lets you take essentially any binary and have it be how the application renders the manifest to deploy into the cluster. So I think a lot of the times it's used for like adding Vault support through a config management plugin, but there's a number of reasons why you might want to use one. But what they've added is that instead of environment variables, there is now first-class support for parameters to go into the config management plugin. So it'll be displayed in the UI saying that these are the parameters that your plugin needs, and in your application you can specify it. It adds, I'm pretty sure it adds support for like specifying the data type for these parameters. So we'll go to back to VS Code here, and we'll take a look. So there's a couple pieces that come together to make this work. So the first is that we've got our config map that declares the config management plugin. So don't be deceived here. This isn't an actual Kubernetes resource. It's just in the same format as a Kubernetes resource. My guess, and I haven't read through the proposal or the work on this to verify this, so this is speculation, is that this leaves room for eventually transitioning to a CR, and that you're already like specifying your config management plugin in this format, and then once there's support in the repo server to magically pick up the CRs in the cluster, presumably through a controller or something, that you could just deploy these as resources instead of in your config map. But in here, we define a basic example of a config management plugin, which is on these phases. So on the generate phase, run this command, which just echoes out a config map in JSON. And then more importantly for version 2.6 here is the parameters. So this is directly pulled from the PR that implemented this on how to test this feature. And it shows an example of the different types of values. So you can have a map, an array, or just your standard string value. And that allows you to put certain constraints on the inputs, while also telling the UI how to properly display these values or these parameters in the UI. So we define our config management plugin. So this will replace, say, Helm or Customize for an application. And then we have to patch the repo server to add in this plugin in a sidecar. So excuse the VS Code highlighting here that's upset that I haven't set resource quotas on this container, but the idea is that we mount that config map into this container, and that makes it aware of the plugin that we're adding. So we've already done this in our Argo CD installation. And then so finally, we need to go ahead and use this config management plugin. So what we do here is we say, we've got a plugin, and we've got this parameter here saying that we want to use the array parameter. We want to provide this array to that config management plugin. And then when we add this to the cluster, we should see these in the UI, like like how you can see the Helm parameters when you're using that to make it a pretty similar experience. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and apply that manifest to the cluster, the application manifest that's using the plugin. And we'll switch back over to Argo CD here and look at the plugin test app. So we'll go and look at the application details here, and you can see that we're pulling parameters in now. So you can see here that there's the normal environment parameters, which I believe was the previous way of working with config management plugins. And now there is a clear specification of what parameters this plugin supports. So here, this is a great example of the benefit of the parameters, in that before, these environment variables are just that. You can add as many as you want, but you have really no idea if the plugin is expecting that variable or what environment variables the plugin is expecting when you're working inside Argo CDs. So, if your ops team is creating this plugin and providing it to the developers as a service, as a tool, you want to make it easy to work with that within Argo CD. And this does this by, telling you explicitly, these are the parameters you need to specify for your application. And you can have defaults set here, and then you can have your individual developers go in and set overrides specific to their scenario.